Hello and welcome to the Inside Risk and Compliance podcast. I'm your host, Adam Spencer, Director of AJ Fox Compliance, a specialist recruitment agency focusing on all things law firm risk and compliance. I have seen so many people carve amazing and fulfilling careers in this space, and it really has been a pleasure speaking to people who enjoy doing what they do every day. However, one thing that has really stood out to me is how hard it can be for people to access the bigger picture outside of their team, outside of their firm. We created this podcast to share with you some of the insights, experiences and stories of the most interesting people succeeding inside risk and compliance. Today I am joined by James Smither, Head of Risk Management at Freshfields. I have been so excited to get James on the podcast because of his focus on enterprise risk, an area that law firms are just starting to get their teeth into. On today's episode, we cover what is enterprise risk and why is it so important, how and why to think about risk appetite, and neurodiversity inclusion in the legal profession. We had such a great time recording today's episode. We really hope you enjoy listening too. So James, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah,
no, it's fantastic to have you on board. So first things first, it would be fantastic if you could give our audience just a little bit of an intro as to who you are, what you do, and how you found your way into this world.
Sure, happy to. So I'm currently the head of risk management at Freshfields. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how I got here, as we were just talking about before, I don't think anyone grows up saying they want to be a risk manager. I certainly didn't have a kind of, lifelong goal. I studied history and international relations at university, which already makes me a bit of a pariah in a law firm context, I have to say. But during that time, that 4-year period, I got quite interested in African politics and African history, and basically saw a job advertised at a specialist risk consultancy called Control Risks. This was back in 2000 for an African political risk analyst, which essentially meant monitoring events in Africa and how they could impact on investors, elections, wars, that kind of good stuff. So I applied for that job thinking this is a good way to use my African knowledge. And then slowly but surely realized during my time as an analyst that I was as interested in the risk part of the job as I was in the Africa part of the job, if that made sense. So I gradually realized I was transitioning from being an Africa geek, if you like, to a risk geek as well. And therefore kind of chose to build out that skill set rather than remaining, a regional focused person. It was more a sort of risk focused person. So that's then determined my career path, which has been a little bit wiggly and interesting. Maybe we'll come on to that, but it's then taken in different aspects of risk. Started off with politics and security, as you can imagine, but then gone into sort of sustainability, compliance, and then pure risk management, which I'm sure we'll come on to as well. Yeah.
And how did you imagine yourself taking that journey into a law firm environment? Did that come out of the complete blue? I imagine it wasn't on the sort of plan you had.
It wouldn't have been an industry I'd have guessed about, and partly because I didn't know whether law firms even did it, and maybe we'll come on to that as well. That it's quite a new discipline for law firms. I guess because of the Africa focus, most of the clients I was working with in the early years of my career were kind of frontier investors into Africa, and that at the time tended to be oil and gas, mining, telecoms to a certain extent. So my assumption would have been, had I gone in-house, it would have been into that kind of industry. And actually, that was my first in-house role, was at a big mining and manufacturing company. So not a million miles off the mark there. But law has come out of the blue a little bit in recent years, I'm not going to lie to you.
But you made that move. And you were saying just before we started recording that you were the first enterprise risk professional possibly in the whole of the law firm world when you moved into that role.
I think so. It was certainly fairly lonely. There's a couple of people that I could find sort of through aggressive searching on LinkedIn that had similar job titles, but as a kind of a senior person focused entirely on enterprise risk, I'm pretty sure I was the first, certainly in the UK. There may have been someone somewhere else in the world I wasn't aware of. So it's definitely a fledgling area for risk for law firms, but I've actually seen more in the last couple of years, definitely, than when I started back in 2019. So it's grown gradually. We're still not, I wouldn't say we'd fill a football stadium, but we might be able to have coffee together now. There's enough of us.
Well, the trend will continue, won't it? I'm sure we'll see more and more firms sort of exploring and investing in that space. But you moved into the legal sector from PwC, right?
Yes.
So how was that transition? What was your impression when you arrived at a law firm, different business model, I guess, some similarities, a lot of differences, and you were arriving with this new concept that presumably was new to most, if not all, people in the business as well. How was that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that question. I think it's interesting how much is similar and how much is different. Obviously, I went from fee earning and accounting to being a business services person in law, so there were differences there. But the partnership model, the mentality of a partnership model firm, the sort of division between people who are client facing and people who fulfill support roles was very familiar. To a certain extent, I was surprised. Law firms still feel like smaller businesses, even with the amount of revenue they make, than a PwC, which is the big four I was at. There's a lot more infrastructure. There's a lot more heft and size in the PwC. So that took a bit of adjusting, realizing that, while the revenues are huge, actually the kind of structures of a law firm are much smaller. But it was a voyage of discovery for them and for me. I think the reason I was hired without bigging myself up was because I'd worked with blue chip companies as a PwC advisor on really perfecting pretty mature ERM frameworks, enterprise risk management frameworks, for FTSE 100 companies, Fortune 500 companies. The law firm I joined at that point, HSF, wanted that kind of expertise. So we want to approach something that looks like what our clients have, essentially. So that was the challenge, and that was an interesting challenge.
And obviously, as we're talking about it being a relatively new area for law firms, our listeners, I'm sure, therefore, will be thinking this is a very new concept for them to be hearing about as well. So, what I'm really excited for you to hopefully be able to shed some light on is, what is enterprise risk? And I guess crucially, why is it important?
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's the schoolwork. So ERM, enterprise risk management, is the concept of unifying risk management and placing it at the strategic level in an organization. So there's a lot of risk management in any organization. A lot of people perform risk management on a daily basis. Perhaps it's part of their job title. Perhaps it's explicit in their job description. Often it's not. HR professionals do risk management. Information security professionals obviously do risk management. Compliance people very obviously do risk management, but they're all operating to a certain extent in narrow verticals of risk management. Enterprise risk essentially puts a wrapper on top of that. It says we are facing a lot of risk as an organization overall. It's a good idea, and this is where I come in. I think it is a good idea to understand the nature of that risk, the quantum of that risk, and what are the really big picture risks that manifest up at a strategic level that could impact positively as well as negatively. And it's an important point to make. Risk is value neutral, so there's definitely upside to risk as well. What are the big picture risks that could really impact our ability to deliver our strategy? And in a law firm, in my experience, that tends to be a kind of 3 to 5 year strategy. What are the big picture risks that leadership needs to be aware of, that we need to have a programmatic approach to managing, monitoring, reporting on? So that's what enterprise risk is. It's that level, that wrapper above all the individual good work going on individual risk areas that's happening, and distilling that, identifying what the key priorities are and reporting that to leadership in a programmatic way.
And how do you actually, it does, and how do you actually go about measuring the risk then and assessing and quantifying it in a way that allows you to then, I guess, take actions with that in mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to explain, I guess, in this kind of context, but it's essentially that process I mentioned, that it's acknowledging that the risk is already being managed to a certain extent within individual teams. So it's aggregating that picture and putting that all into a common framework, because having a single language of risk is quite important. Different teams will think about risk in very different ways, and it's actually therefore very hard to put the risks that they think they're dealing with next to each other and say to leadership, this is the big one you have to worry about. So there is a certain amount of quantification. What's the financial impact on us is the most obvious one, the dollars one, right? If this does happen, and it does happen to us this year, what does that mean for our revenues? What does it mean for our profitability? So that's one way of achieving a common language, is achieving a common measurement stick, if you like, for different types of risk. But of course, it's not just financial risk as well. And we don't want to prioritize risk purely on a financial basis, because some of the most existential risks you could face as a law firm won't actually have an immediate financial cost, but they could have much more serious corrosive impact on your reputation, your ability to recruit in the marketplace, which is where you guys come in, obviously, and so on. So we tend to look across multiple different dimensions of impact and make sure we're thinking about long-term impact as well as short-term dollars and cents.
And it must be quite eye-opening for senior leadership, right? Because I'm imagining, correct me if I'm wrong, but often when they're talking about risk issues, it might not have been quantified in quite the same way. So if you're arriving with numbers on a spreadsheet, and that, I guess money talks, doesn't it? Must be being viewed in a different way now. You'd be able to quantify it.
It's a reframing conversation. It can be quite interesting in that respect. There's a lot of assumptions that go on before risk management gets involved. We're a bunch of professionals, and often in law firms we're a bunch of lawyers. We naturally understand this stuff. Surely we're managing it effectively. And often the answer is some of the things we think we're managing effectively we are, but some of the other things actually we're not. There's a lot of room for improvement. And then there are issues that sit not naturally within individual teams within a law firm. So I would use geopolitical risk as a really key example there. There isn't a public affairs team, a government affairs team in most law firms, even the biggest ones. It's just not the kind of industry that needs that kind of skill set in the same way that a tobacco company or a large manufacturing company would. Who's responsible for that? And then we do get hit by geopolitical risk, right? We've had Brexit, and most significantly for the law firms, we've had Russia, Ukraine, a year and a half ago. there isn't actually a function that has the responsibility for tracking that kind of thing, preparing for it in advance, coordinating responses. So it can be quite eye-opening to say there are actually areas of risk here that we think should be on the table that actually no one's currently accountable for. There isn't a plan for currently. And that's hopefully where you add the value, right? By identifying those gaps, you can start filling them.
And are we sort of at that point? Do you think that, if more firms had public affairs professionals in place, a few years ago, would there be opportunity to have dealt with current circumstances better in a more profitable manner, or reduce the loss that could have come about? I
mean, it's hard to be counterfactual in that way. I guess we only know what we know, and we don't know how things could have gone. And I think law firms actually handled the Russia-Ukraine thing fairly well. I mean, to a certain extent, everyone was lucky that everyone was going through the same thing at the same time. So most big firms had an office in Moscow. Most firms took the decision within 1 week to close them, and then most went through the same process of closing them down. But do I think there could have been more agile decision-making with a bit more anticipation about what was going to happen? Yes, of course I do. And I would say that, wouldn't I, to a certain extent. But there were lots of warning signs that Russia was not your average office on the global footprint. There were a lot of warning signs about what Putin was about. There were a lot of warning signs. They had actually invaded Ukraine previously. Let's not forget there was already an occupied, situation in Ukraine. So I like to think that, forewarned is forearmed. And the more you do that, the more prepared you are to make strategic decisions. And, I don't know if we're going to come on to a geopolitics discussion, but the obvious counterpoint to Russia now is China. It's a similar question. Will there be a war with China at some point over Taiwan? Law firms should be having those conversations now rather than reacting after the fact, which is essentially what happened with Russia-Ukraine, because most people's businesses in China are a lot bigger than they are in Russia. So you can afford to get it wrong a lot less in China than you would have been able to do in Russia. So it's a much bigger dot on the map, if you like.
I just wanted to take a moment out to thank our amazing sponsor, the International Compliance Association. The ICA are the leading professional body for the global regulatory and financial crime community, offering professional qualifications, world-class events and training. Go check them out online, and if any of the certificates or courses take your fancy, then you can get 10% discount using our code AJFOX10 at checkout.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about the fact there's the positive and the negative side. We're talking about avoiding negative consequences, but are you saying then that it's the case that you could identify areas where actually maybe there's a lot of work that the firm could be taking on that does sit within a risk appetite, but it's that we haven't assessed the risk appetite in the right way, and we're missing out on more income?
Yeah, I mean, China's another example of that, right? You have to have a risk appetite around China, and do we work with Chinese state-owned companies is a topic that most big law firms have been grappling with. Previously, my answer might have been a simple yes, but since the US-China bilateral tensions have got a lot worse, there's an opportunity cost to taking on more work in China that mean you can't do work with US government clients, for example. So that kind of risk appetite weighing is very much a live topic. So but getting the opportunity is absolutely part of the discussion. We may come onto AI at some point, but AI for me is the perfect example of a risk appetite question. We all know there's a massive opportunity with AI, and on the flip side, there's a massive threat both to how we've all done our business currently in pretty much every profession you can think of, but also in terms of when things go wrong with AI, they can go very badly wrong, and that would be hugely bad news for a law firm. So there's a perfect risk appetite example there of how much do we invest in AI, how much do we want to be the first mover and try and get that advantage with clients by being the first to automate, the first to use robots on large matters and complex mandates, versus letting other people make the mistakes first, go over the road bumps and hit them and learn from their lessons. And that's a perfect risk appetite question, and different law firms will come to different conclusions on that.
Have you got thoughts on AI and its impact on firms at the moment?
I do, that should probably be a podcast of itself, but I do think it's going to be transformative for the sector. I mean, let's be clear, law firms have been using AI for a while now. The big discussion recently has been the generative AI, so the chat GPT type stuff, the actual robots producing content that would previously been produced by humans. That is transformative. And let's face it, clients are going to start saying how much of what you're giving me is actually done by humans, how much of it's been done by robots. Therefore, why am I paying for humans if I could be paying for robots? This law firm's offering more of a robot content than you are. Is that better or worse than what you're offering? Well, how do you differentiate your humans from their robots and so on? So yes, of course, it's massively transformative. And I think we're only just scratching at the surface of how transformative it's going to be. But my prediction would be in 20 years' time, that soon the business models of law firms will look very different. The staffing models will look very different. How we interact with clients will be very different. This is a transformative risk with a huge upside. As I say, it's not huge
upside. And then people talking about the terrifying negatives and downsides as well. And I find it fascinating. It's not an area I know a huge amount about, but even if we don't imagine AI going beyond our level of intelligence, it's the speed at which it can operate. The speed at which it can undertake tasks. Can achieve something that would take us 20 years to do, an amount, even if we're just talking about really basic content, nothing crazy, you could potentially get it to create 20 years worth of content in probably 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And the impact that could have is
and going through vast
terrifying.
volumes of data and drawing conclusions from it, that's where the real obvious potential for law firms is, because currently that's something you get your paralegals or your trainees to do, right? I'll leave aside the existential risk of will AI end up eradicating all of us. There's less we can kind of do about that as individual firms, but you're right, it's really exciting, it's kind of terrifying. I had a terrifying moment recently talking to someone who knows more about it than I do, and they were telling me something I didn't know, which I haven't seen much in the public discourse, which is the people who developed ChatGPT don't understand how it works. So they understand how they built it, but they don't actually know how it works to the extent that it's coming to the conclusions and producing the outputs that it's producing. It's something that's happening within a machine that even the cleverest minds who've developed those machines don't. That to me is faintly terrifying. Right? We built something that we don't actually understand how it's getting better and how it's learning and how it's kind of replicating itself. That's fairly terrifying. And the potential, the rapidity of the change and things we don't even anticipate that it will be able to do now, it will be able to do in 5 months or 6 months. That's why it has to be on everyone's agenda, I think.
And what is your mindset around these sorts of things? And I guess maybe we'll carry on talking about AI as an example, but do you look at these things from a positive and excited and opportunity opening perspective, focusing more on that? Are you more concerned with the downside, negative? I mean, I guess it has to be balanced, right? But does one of those drive you more than the others?
It's a lovely question. I mean, I think that you do get some pretty dour and downside focused risk people. I try to be both. I'm really excited by the stuff I find, as you can probably tell from how animated I get, I find stuff like politics and technology to a certain extent, although I understand it less, really exciting. So of course, the opportunity is a huge part of it, but I think it is the job of people like me who work in risk and compliance also to be there. And I'm not embarrassed about that. I think it's important to have people who are saying, hold on a minute, we need to consider that the things can go wrong as well as right. We shouldn't just run fully into this without our eyes open and without looking where we're treading and thinking about the consequences. So I do try and balance that. And I do feel that, that's a really important part of my job, is to be the person who's saying, let's not do this, but let's think about what could happen if we do this and plan for that in advance, so we're more likely to do it successfully. You're more likely to have a successful journey if you have a map and provisions in your car and a spare tire and petrol. That's the sort of boring stuff that means you're going to have a more successful journey. So I'm the person who's saying, let's do that. Let's get the oil in the engine check before we head off. And that's really important with stuff like that, because there are downsides, about the fake stuff, about the algorithmic bias stuff, about the potential for fraudulent content, which will have impacts on law firms as well. We have to be mindful of that. We can't just run headless chicken style into it thinking this is how we beat the competition. That's the surest way to fall on your face, I think.
You saw there was a US attorney who was pulled up for
the Anchor case. I mean, there's a clear example right there. But we'll see that. There'll be individual lawyers in individual law firms who think, it's coming up to 10 p.m. and I'd rather not be here till midnight. So I might just ask ChatGPT to write this summary rather than doing it myself. At some point that will be uncovered, and we'll see it in applications for law firms. People will get ChatGPT to write their job applications. You'll see that as well through candidates, I'm sure, and that will be replicated across the board. So even if a law firm has a policy and decides whether or not to use it, systematically individuals will still push the edges and take their chances as well, like that lawyer in New York with the Anchor case did. It's a pretty devastating effect, right?
Absolutely. And when you find yourself in a law firm trying to secure that buy-in around what you're doing, when we were speaking before we started recording, you were talking about feeling that people working in risk and compliance should be unapologetically proud of what they do. How does that mean you approach things in terms of securing that buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of boring story I told about going on a journey and making sure you're prepared for it is part of that narrative, right? Like we're more likely to get to where we want to go if we're thinking about all the things that could go wrong than if we just set off driving with hope in our hearts and a smile on our faces. So that's part of it. I'll not lie to you. It helps if you've had some salutary experiences. Like it's a much easier conversation to come in and talk about risk management in an environment where some things have gone wrong and people have realized that it might have been useful to have a slightly more kind of, frameworked approach to thinking about risk. So that is always helpful. And if it's not your law firm, it's always helpful to use examples of other law firms as well. So there are, high profile examples of things going wrong, whether that's conduct, whether it's cybersecurity, or whether it's regulatory compliance. You do have to use a little bit of, war stories to help the message. But the most important thing is this support strategy, right? This is not an abstract exercise that's just about pretty risk registers and heat maps and, joyful things that someone like me perhaps enjoys producing. It's actually about your strategy. If you want to deliver your strategy, that's what most leadership teams want to do. That's what they've been elected for in the case of law firms, or appointed for in the case of corporates want to do. The best way to achieve your strategy is to think about it in a holistic 360-degree manner and think about the things that could go wrong, but also the things that could accelerate. And that's where I talk about upside risk. Again, AI is the example. AI could actually help you achieve more than you plan to, as well as potentially, pull the rug out from under your feet. So that's the sales pitch. It's not always that easy. You don't always get the sort of the elevated time to do it, but that's the sort of messaging that has to come through, and then it's sort of making the business case for ERM. But yeah, don't apologize for it. Don't say it's bad to think about risk. That's when you start losing people. I think this is really important. It's value adding stuff.
Definitely. No, I think that's great advice. So you've done a lot to help our audience understand one topic.
Hope so.
Another topic I know you're really passionate about is encouraging neurodiversity inclusion in law firms. So again, it'd be really helpful for our audience if you could just explain what is neurodiversity and what are the issues and challenges and how do we solve them?
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it. It's another passion of mine alongside, politics and stuff like that. So neurodiversity in a very basic sense is the concept that all our brains work differently. We all think in different ways, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a disabling thing. It's not a judgment thing. It's just a fact. Neurodiversity means people's brains work in different ways. There are some classic neurodiversity conditions that people will have heard of, autism being a very prominent one, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, and so on. Those kind of diagnoses what form the constituencies of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity inclusion is a recognition that lots of people have these kind of conditions. Many have more than one, and the estimate within society is perhaps as many as 1 in 5, certainly 1 in 7 may have at least one neurodiversity condition. So we're not talking about a tiny number of people here. We're talking about, if you have a team of 5 people, chances are one person in your team might be neurodivergent. Neurodiversity inclusion, getting to the point, is that we should make our organisations, our industry, in the case of the legal sector, more aware of this and ultimately more inclusive. That means our recruitment processes, which is important for you guys, but it also means our working environments. There's quite a lot about the law that's quite old-fashioned and quite excluding. I think this goes across multiple diversity characteristics, actually. It's not just about neurodiversity, it's also about, ethnicity inclusion, gender inclusion, sexuality inclusion, and so on. But some of the things we do in law firms we've just done because we've always done it for 200 years. And I'm quite keen to question some of that. Are there ways to do things better? Are there easy wins that make accessing the profession and flourishing with it easier for people with different brains or different physical characteristics? So that's what it's all about.
And if there's someone listening out there who is involved in neurodiversity inclusion or is hoping to get involved in that at their firm, are there 1 or 2 easy wins you can give away for free today in terms of things that you think they can focus on to help start that journey? Yeah,
to start the journey is getting people together to talk about it. So the biggest piece of advice I give law firms at the start of the journey is start to network. Get people together who are passionate about it, like me, who have a personal connection to it, or who may be neurodivergent themselves, and they will be your biggest source of allies, your advocates, the people who have ideas for easy things the firm can do to make itself more neurodiversity inclusive. But if you are keen to get involved, also look up the Legal Neurodiversity Network on LinkedIn. That's a group that I help coordinate that's now got over 40 different law firms working together on sharing ideas, pooling best practices, making the case for having neurodiversity inclusion alongside, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. as a real focus for law firm D&I, because we think it's a bit neglected. Frankly, it's a newer topic. It hasn't had as much attention or investment. So that's what we're all about. So Legal Neurodiversity Network on LinkedIn. Look us up.
Amazing. Yeah, well, definitely people should go and check that out. And is there anything specific to law firms that you've seen as a particular challenge around neurodiversity inclusion?
Yeah, if I could point to one thing, I guess it's the sort of tired stereotypes that law firms rest on to a certain extent. The recruitment model can be quite excluding. The sort of the assessment day model, the Watson Glaser test, some of these things are inherently quite excluding. You're putting people into a room and making them perform against each other and carry out psychometric testing. There's a lot of evidence that doesn't work for autistic people.
I find it really fascinating that because I don't know whether these companies do tests to demonstrate its falsifiability, but if it's a good theory, it should be falsifiable, which means you should, to test it properly, you should hire someone who fails and see if they work out or not. But, as far as I'm aware, there's not firms who are every now and again just hiring a load of people who fail the tests they're putting out there.
And that's my question. Are people actually doing that because of evidence or because it's just something that's always been done? And it's just one of the steps that we make people jump through before we hire them as trainees. I'm not sure about that, but we do know the evidence that it's excluding and it's knocking people out of the process who perhaps would be very, very good in a lot of different roles in law firms. And I think that's sad. So I think looking at the stereotypes of what a good lawyer looks like or sounds like or acts like and really breaking it down, is that always what our clients want, or do our clients want diverse teams who most importantly think differently, because that's what we know. The power of different minds is when they're brought together, they come up with better ideas than having a bunch of homogenous people who all came through the same very narrow funnel to get in and all think the same, all went to the same schools, have the same accents, have the same backgrounds. I don't think our clients want that. They certainly won't in the future. So for law firms to get competitive advantage actually is to have differently thinking teams. And do our recruitment processes really give them different thinking teams? I'm not sure.
And I think, some of those stereotypes themselves also just lead to negative impacts on well-being generally as well. So it does sound like they are a good thing to target, those stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean by the sort of the traditions of law, like work hard, play hard is a cliche, but to unpack that a little bit, is that really such a healthy attitude to be espousing for everyone? It certainly doesn't work for everyone. I'm not sure it's what our clients would necessarily expect either. So again, let's just tackle some of these these sacred cows, or just just unquestioned attributes of law firms and break them down a little bit.
Brilliant. Well, James, look, that's been really interesting, really helpful for our audience. Lots of value there. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've really appreciated you being here.
No problem. Great to come on. I hope it was helpful. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We really hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast as much as we enjoyed recording it. If you did, please do us a huge favour and share it with a friend or a colleague. The more people we can get listening, the more time and energy we can get into recording more episodes and getting the best guests and the most interesting stories and insights. I want to say a huge thank you to the ICA for their support, to Ty and Karem here in the studio, and a massive thanks to Kat for making sure everything runs so smoothly behind the scenes. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, follow us on LinkedIn to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.